monographs about important single artists, and historicised thinking about kind of new practices and new forms of practice and the politics of those practices. So that's a little bit, if we are beginning to enter into a curatorial phase, that might be where we're going. But Royona, please tell us.
Thank you, Rachel. Well, first of all, thank you to Rachel, Peter, and Paula and Peter for believing in this book, which doesn't exist yet, but I'm going to pretend it's going to insert itself into this space, hopefully April, May next year. While Pratna was talking, it struck me that there's a very moving connection between where this book began for me and her narrative. And actually, when I was training in Kathak back in India from about the age of 7 till 16, the person or the people whose work sort of changed the way I looked at performance was actually these two angry feminists. Ranjapati Sharkar and Manjushri Jakisharkar's performance of, actually Ranjapati Sharkar's performance of Cassandra. And it suddenly made me think or realize that there was a world of moving language beyond classicism. There was a world beyond the national myth, because they were working with fundamentally intercultural mythology and womanhood. And it suddenly made me think, I remember going back with my mother and going home with my mother and saying, I think I want there to be some other kind of training that I want to work with. And actually, for 2 years, I trained at the Dancers Guild, where I never met Pratna, but she was a teacher there. So we never met until we both arrived in this country, but she was teaching there at the time. So there's a real moving story there, because it is that first performance of Cassandra that made me think beyond Kathak and beyond classicism. And once I had finished my 2 years of training at Dancers Guild, it really kind of fed me to go beyond India and to expand my performance training in this country. So I won't bore you with all of those details there, but fast forward many years, and during my master's training at Royal Holloway in physical theatre, I encountered Akram's work for the first time, watching Polaroid Feet, which is one of his classical pieces. And what struck me was the ability, again, to talk about the now, the present, through absolute organic connections to the past, and yet to make that past and that classicism accessible and relevant to the now. And I suppose I went back to my master's studies and started to think about the way in which my own body was training in multiple cultural languages and traditions, and the way in which I was trained in Kathak. There were, without realizing, retrospectively I realized there were many parallels between my own training and between the work that I had seen in Akram's piece. I then, several years later, embarked on a PhD thesis, which ultimately became a sort of a post-colonial reading. Now, retrospectively looking back, became quite a kind of standard reading of his work in post-colonial terms of the third space. But there was a moment in my PhD viva which really was the birth of this monograph. That's where I'm trying to get to, where Professor John Hutnick from Goldsmiths, who was my internal examiner, said to me at the end of the viva, "You don't need Homi Bhabha." And I don't think anybody, I don't think he even remembers having made that comment, but it had a profound impact on me that I didn't need such a seminal theorist in order to actually talk about the practice that I wanted to theorize. So there was a gap. In that gap, I had a daughter and came back to the work. And when I came back to the work, I came back to it with a complete fresh pair of eyes. And what became the project was fundamentally two things. One, in the book, I dismantle this myth that he is a contemporary South Asian dancer and dismantle the label contemporary Kathak. It's unhelpful. It equates contemporization with westernization. It reduces both Kathak in terms of its complexities and this kind of massive world of contemporary dance that we also seem to suggest is just the one thing. So in dismantling that, what I suggest what he's doing is he's bringing sensibilities and dramaturgical conventions from his Kathak training and actually reinvigorating British physical theatre or Western dance theatre. I go into that, that sort of territory in the book. And what I'm saying is he's changing that landscape of contemporary physical theatre in fundamentally intercultural ways. So there's a shift between seeing him and his ethnicity as the defining factor of his art to actually suggesting he's fundamentally changing the way in which we understand Western contemporary dance practices. I look at, and Farouk is absolutely right, what was equally exciting but nerve-wracking for me is working about someone who's still making work and who continues to make work. And in some ways it's been, I've kind of gone, stop making work now. There's no more I can include in this monograph. But I start with his work for the Olympics, the choreography for the Olympics, and the book ends with his choreography for English National Ballet. So those are kind of two profoundly public profile platforms for his work, which are changing in one context his understanding of his work in the popular context, and in the other context in another classical context. So it's an exciting sort of journey there that I trace. I don't do it chronologically, and I then look at 6 other case studies through the work. The other fundamental bit of the book, which is the subtitle, which is Dancing New Interculturalism, I feel redefines interculturalism from the point of view of an embodied condition and an aesthetic, as opposed to the 1980s project of intercultural theatre, which was an intellectual project predominantly carried out by Western theatre practitioners on and through non-Western bodies, traditions, artifacts, myths, etc. And I'm arguing for an interculturalism that is a lived reality, that is an embodied condition, and that translates into an aesthetic where Akram lulls Western audiences into thinking that they understand otherness, and then he punches them in the gut and makes them actually realize that you don't understand everything about us. They're not necessarily even us and them, but his aesthetic is able to undercut familiarity with otherness because he actually speaks from the point of view of another. So there is a redefining of new interculturalism there in the book as well, which I hope will not only speak to dance studies and dance scholars and artists, but also to intercultural theorists and practitioners at large.
Great.
Thank you very much.